I'm Bob Canary, and I've been giving a series of talks on the life and times of the English sonnet. Now, if you haven't listened to any of them, the main takeaway that's relevant to today is that the sonnet is very old. After all, the sonnet's been around since the 13th century. And when you are old, there are times when you look in the mirror and say to yourself, "Is that really me?" And so there are times when a sonnet is sometimes not itself. Now, we know what makes a sonnet a sonnet. It's a kind of lyric poem consisting of 14 rhymed lines. And in English, all or most of those lines should be in iambic pentameter, that is 5 units called feet, with a relatively weak syllable followed by a relatively heavily stressed syllable, as in these lines from those aging poets, the Rolling Stones. I met a gin-soaked ballroom queen in Memphis. She tried to take me upstairs for a ride. Now, if you're wondering about the Memphis, traditionally, poets are allowed an extra weak syllable at the end of a line, or for that matter, a missing weak syllable at the beginning of an iambic pentameter line. Anyway, we know the rules that sonnets follow. Here's a poem about those rules. It's by Billy Collins, an American poet who was our poet laureate in 2001 to 2003. And the poem is called Sonnet. In listening to it, it may help to remember that Petrarch wrote hundreds of sonnets to his unattainable muse, Laura. All we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. And after this one, just a dozen. To launch a little ship on love's storm-tossed seas. Then only 10 more left, like rows of beans. How easily it goes, unless you get Elizabethan and insist on the iambic bongos must be played and rhymes positioned at the ends of lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on here while we make the turn into the final 6, where all will be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Petrarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and come at last to bed. Now, hang on here indeed. Is this really a sonnet? It's 14 lines, all right, and it has the semi-traditional turn of direction between the first 8 and last 6 lines. But it isn't really rhymed, though it sometimes comes close. And it's only occasionally iambic pentameter, though most of its lines are about the right length. Is it a sonnet or not? Well, let's look at another sonnet. Those lips that love's own hand did make breathed forth the sound that said, I hate, to me that languished for her sake. But when she saw my woeful state, straight in her heart did mercy come, chiding that tongue that ever sweet was used in giving gentle doom, and taught it thus anew to greet. I hate, she altered with an end, that followed it as gentle day doth follow night, who like a fiend from heaven to hell is flown away. I hate, from hate a wave she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you. The lady catches herself when she sees how distressed the man is, and winds up saying, I hate not you. Now, this looks like a proper sonnet, 14 lines of rhymed iambics. But let's take another look at those iambics. Those lips that love's own hand did make breathed forth the sound that said, I hate. Something's wrong here. There are only 4 strong stresses instead of 5. This is not iambic pentameter. It's iambic tetrameter. So it isn't a sonnet. On the other hand, this is Shakespeare's sonnet number 145. And if a sonnet by Shakespeare is not a sonnet, what is? So we can't complain when a modern poet writes 3 poems and calls them 3 sonnets in tetrameter. These 3 sonnets are among Millay's later and less anthologized works. They're about the coming of World War II. And here is the middle sonnet of the 3. See how these masses mill and swarm and troop and muster and assail. God, we could keep this planet warm by friction if the sun should fail. Mercury, Saturn, Venus, Mars, if no prow cuts your arid seas, then in your weightless air no wars explode with such catastrophes as rock our planet all but loose from its frayed mooring to the sun. Law will not sanction such abuse forever. When the mischief's done, planets rejoice, on which at night rains but the 12-ton meteorite. Now, as the nations mass for war, the poet reflects that if sun should fail, human beings could keep this planet warm by friction alone. And spared humanity's wars, the other planets are lucky to escape what war must do in the end to Earth. No bombs will fall on them, only the occasional heavy meteorite. Now this is a sonnet, so we have to revise our rules to say that English sonnets are in iambic pentameter, but an occasional iambic tetrameter is okay. All right, now let's look at another Shakespeare sonnet. The forward violet thus did I chide, sweet thief, whence didst thou steal thy sweet that smells, if not from my love's breath? The purple pride which on thy soft cheek for complexion dwells, in my love's veins thou hast too grossly dyed. The lily I condemned for thy hand, and buds of marjoram had stolen thy hair. The roses fearfully on thorns did stand, one blushing shame, another white despair. A third, nor red nor white, had stolen of both, and to his robbery had annexed thy bless. But for his theft, in pride of all his growth, a vengeful canker eat him up to death. More flowers I noted, yet I none could see, but sweet or colour it had stolen from thee. And this is Shakespeare's sonnet number 99. And there's something amiss here as well. There are 15 lines. Can you tell where the extra line is stuck in? In the usual Shakespeare sonnet, you have 3 4-line stanzas, or quatrains, with 2 rhymes each, and then a final couplet. In this sonnet, Shakespeare has added an extra line with the first quatrain's rhyme, so that there are 5 lines in what should be a quatrain. Now, having made my point, I'll spare you the full text, but Shakespeare's 126 has only 12 lines, made up of 6 couplets in a row. If Shakespeare can have a 15-line sonnet, why stop there? Now here's a 16-line poem by the Victorian novelist and poet George Meredith. His wife left him for a painter, and being a poet, he naturally turned this into verse, in a sequence of 50 poems called Modern Love. Incidentally, his first and best-known novel, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, also begins with a man being left by his wife for another man. This is number 15 in the sequence. I think she sleeps. It must be sleep, when low hangs that abandoned arm toward the floor, the face turned with it. Now make fast the door. Sleep on. It is your husband, not your foe. The poet's black stage line of wronged love frights not our modern dames. Well, if he did. Now will I pour new light upon that lid, full sloping like the breasts beneath. Sweet dove, your sleep is pure. Nay, pardon, I disturb. Are you not? Good. Her waking infant stare grows woman to the burden my hands bear. Her own handwriting to me, when no curb was left on passion's tongue. She trembles through, a woman's tremble, the whole instrument. I show another letter lately sent. The words are very like. The name is new. And the poet's unfaithful wife lies sleeping as he enters and closes the door behind him. She's no need to fear him because he's too modern to take violent revenge. He just writes a poetic sequence. She wakes like an innocent infant, but becomes all woman when she sees what she has brought with him, 2 letters in her own handwriting. One written to the poet himself when they were passionately in love, and another along the same lines, but addressed to a different name. It is, of course, her lover's name. Now, 16 lines or not, it is quite customary to refer to the poems in modern love as sonnets. It seems that the 14-line rule for sonnets is indeed negotiable. Now, what's going on here? I think it's a kind of duck test, a name given to the expression, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. Regular readers of poetry don't recognize sonnets by counting lines and stresses. They see a poem of about the right length and with lines about the right length and read it as a sonnet. Poetic forms are just sets of expectations established by our having read previous examples of that form. In some way, that's the main point of today's talk and its inventory of variant forms. In this case, a 15 or 16-line poem can be read as a sonnet because there are so many 14-line sonnets that they look rather alike. Now here's a sonnet with another way of violating the usual rules. It's called Sunday Morning, and it's by the Irish-born British poet Louis MacNeice. Down the road, someone is practicing scales. The notes, like little fishes, vanish with a wink of tails. Man's heart expands to tinker with his car. For this is Sunday morning, fate's great bazaar. Regard these means as ends. Concentrate on this now, and you may grow to music, or drive beyond Hindhead anyhow. Take corners on 2 wheels until you go so fast that you can clutch a fringe or 2 of the windy past, that you can abstract this day and make it to the week of time a small eternity, a sonnet self-contained in rhyme. But listen, up the road something gulps. The church spire opens its 8 bells out, skull's mouths which will not tire, to tell how there is no music or movement which secures escape from the weekday time, which deadens and endures. In different ways, we seek escape on weekends. But the church bells remind us that in the end there is no escape. Now this has 14 rhymed lines, though even the rhyme scheme is unusual. It's 7 couplets in a row. There's an almost deliberate avoidance of the pure iambic pentameter da-da-da-da-da-da, and a rather special affinity for putting 2 strong stresses together. But the dominant rhythm here has 6 beats rather than the 5 beats of a pentameter line. The name for this is hexameter, and it's rare in English because it's very hard to keep it from collapsing into 3-beat lines shoved together. One can also keep all the other features of a sonnet while lacking any fixed meter at all, as in this next sonnet, which is by Kate Light. She's a contemporary American poet and also a professional violinist. And the sonnet is called Reading Someone Else's Love Poems, and the title is really a part of the work. Reading someone else's love poems is, after all we've ever done for centuries, except write them. But what a strange thing it is, after all, rose cheeks and sun hair and lips and underarms and that little gut I love to nuzzle on, soft underbelly. Whoops, that wasn't what I meant to talk about. Ever since handkerchiefs fell and hoop skirts around ankles swirled and smiled, lovers have dreamed their loves upon the pages, courted and schemed and twirled and styled, hoping that once they'd unfurled their down deep longing, they would have their prize. Not the songs of love, but love beneath disguise. That is, from the beginning down to the latest rocker or rapper, we've written love songs in hopes of attaining our heart's desire. And reading them, we may find ourselves distracted by our own desires, thinking perhaps of that little gut I love to nuzzle on. Here's another variation. The sonnet, as a general rule, is designed as the form for a single poem. And most sonnets, even in sonnet sequences like those of Shakespeare or George Meredith, can be read as isolated poems. But one can also have linked sonnets, more closely linked than in a simple sonnet sequence. And the most complex such form is probably the sonnet corona, also known as the crown of sonnets, in which the last line of one sonnet becomes the first line of the next, and so on. Sonnet coronas are obviously too long for me to read you one, but I can read you an example of a double sonnet. 2 sonnets so linked together that neither makes sense without the other. In my example, in fact, one sentence even runs over between the 2 sonnets, making it absolutely impossible to sever the link between them and still make sense. Now, these sonnets are by Rafael Campo. They're part of a longer sequence of sonnets called Afraid of the Dark. The sequence deals with his complex feelings about blackness, given that he comes from a Cuban-American family of mestizo origin. It may also be relevant to note here that he is a gay man and a Harvard-trained practicing physician. A black man in the ER waits for me. I take my time because the sign-out says he's homeless, alcoholic, probably a shooter too, complaining of 3 days of headache, fever, not quite 102, a cough, and short of breath. It's either AIDS or just another boring case of flu. A list of other diagnoses fades as I catch sight of him, half hidden by the puke-stained yellow curtain. He looks fine, my intern gripes. A disembodied cry suggests the possibility of pain. I notice all the doctors here are white, while nearly all the patients that we treat are black or brown. He stares back wearily, as though he knows the next experiment in which he's made the subject has to be as flawed as all the others. Once we've spent a couple minutes on his history, and we'll fill the gaps ourselves, it's time to find a vein. The Great Society, Tuskegee, Martin Luther King. Though blind, my stick surprises me with how his blood so briskly flows, as if by force of habit. My intern asked me whether we'll exclude immunocompromise. I bet he has it, she crows. But I am thinking of his eyes, the blankness of a hope not realized. Dr. Poet is moving from patient to patient in an emergency room. Now, the symptoms of this patient do not seem all that serious, and the poet's intern complains that the patient looks fine. The patient is obviously in pain, though, and the poet can't help noticing that most of the doctors here are white, and nearly all the patients black or brown. The patient stares at the doctor without much hope, which may be why signposts of black history and sources of hope pass through the doctor's mind. The Great Society, Tuskegee, Martin Luther King. When they draw his blood, the patient's blood flows briskly, perhaps because he's accustomed to selling his blood to blood banks, or perhaps because he has been in ER often before. The intern asks if they will check for a weakened immune system, thinking that either drugs or AIDS or both might have led to that. But the poet thinks instead of the blankness of a hope not realized in the patient's eye. Like many of the sonnets I've read in this talk, the Campo's sonnets have a lot of inexact rhymes, partial rhymes, near rhymes, half rhymes, call them what you will. But there are sonnets which dispense with rhyme altogether. And one of them is John Updike's Island Cities. Updike was quite a good poet, although he's better known as a novelist and possibly at his best in his short stories. Here's the sonnet. You see them from airplanes, nameless green islands in the oceanic rectilinear plains, 30 or 40 blocks, compact, but with everything needed visibly in place. The high school playing fields, the swatch of park along the crooked river, the feeder highways, the main drag like a zipper, outlying malls sliced from the dirt-colored cakes of plowed farmland. Small lives, we think, pat, flat in such tight grids, but much like brains with every crease cat scanned. These cities keep their secrets, vagaries of the spirit, groundwater that floods the nearby quarries and turns them sky blue, dewdrops of longing, jewels boxed in these blocks. Now, seen from the air, the towns below look much the same, and it's easy to dismiss them as little boxes in which people lead small lives. But their inner lives escape us, as the mind's secrets escape a CAT scan. There are jewels boxed in these blocks. Now, this sonnet has the sonnet's typical turn between the first 8 and the last 6 lines. And as with the sonnet by Billy Collins, which I started with, there are perhaps hints of sounds, echoing sounds in this poem. The place at the end of line 4 echoes second line's plains, for example. And we might even see an echo in the last 3 lines with their initial consonant clusters with L, floods, blue, and blocks. Such echoes are probably not accidental, and they may have some subliminal effect. But I think readers are bound to experience this as an unrhymed poem, and yet one that feels like a sonnet. And one can go further than this. Here's a poem by the Mississippi poet Beth Anne Fennelly. It's called Poem Not to be Read at Your Wedding. You ask me for a poem about love in place of a wedding present, trying to save me money. For 3 nights I've lain under the glow-in-the-dark stars I've stuck to the ceiling over my bed. I've listened to the songs of the galaxy. Well, Carmen, I would rather give you your 3rd set of stick knives than tell you what I know. Let me find you some other store-bought present. Don't make me warn you of stars, how they see us from that distance as miniature and breakable, from the bride who tops the wedding cake to the Mary on Pinto dashboards, holding her ripe red heart in her hands. Now, the poet does not want to comply with the kindly suggestion that she can just write a wedding poem instead of spending money on a present. It's not just that the stars remind us of our own insignificance. We are breakable. And this is what she knows about love. Its fragility. And probably not a poem one would like read at one's wedding. And this is definitely a poem, though an unrhymed one. It's not an iambic pentameter or any other traditional meter, but it does have a rhythmic pattern of sorts, an alternation between lines with a stress on the last syllable and those with a stress on the penultimate syllable. It's verse, not prose. And whether you call it a sonnet or not, it does reference the traditional sonnet form. But after all, getting rid of rhyme is sort of half measure. Why not get rid of verse itself? Then you have a prose sonnet. And this is not a new idea. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose poetry is often fairly advanced for its time, wrote a sonnet called Woods, a Prose Sonnet. Now it's one long paragraph, but I will be breaking it in two, partly to call attention to a change in direction. Wise are ye, O ancient woods, wiser than man. Whoso goeth in your paths or into your thickets where no paths are, readeth the same cheerful lesson, whether he be a young child or 100 years old. Comes he in good fortune or bad, ye say the same things, and from age to age. Ever the needles of the pine grow and fall, the acorns on the oak, the maples redden in autumn, and at all times of the year the ground pine and the perola bud and root under the foot. What is called fortune and what is called time by men, ye know them not. Men have not the language to describe one moment of your eternal life. This I would ask of you, O sacred woods, when ye shall next give me somewhat to say, give me also the tune wherein to say it. Give me a tune of your own, like your winds or rains or brooks or birds. For the songs of men grow old when they have been often repeated. But yours, though a man have heard them for 70 years, are never the same, but always new, like time itself, or like love. Now, aside from this change of direction, this certainly does not look much like a traditional sonnet. But Emerson asks us to read it as a sonnet, as poetry as much as prose. Perhaps he even wants us to see the change of direction as equivalent to the turn of a sonnet after the first 8 lines. Now, to be fair, Emerson's prose is often pretty damn poetic. The prose poem I just read, with its invocation of the eternal life of nature in these sacred woods, expresses the kind of transcendentalist faith in nature as an expression of the divine, which is also found in Emerson's famous essay on nature. A more common pattern for a prose sonnet is probably the division into 14 sentences or numbered statements, as in the following poem by a contemporary Native American poet and novelist, Sherman Alexie. I probably should acknowledge that these days Alexie is in some serious disrepute because of sexual harassment allegations. The poem is entitled Sonnet with Saxophone. This poem doesn't contain a saxophone or any reference to music played with or without the saxophone. This poem, though written by a Native American, will not contain any reference to Native Americans, or more idiomatically speaking, Indians, or speaking in slang, skins. This poem will not be funny. This poem is very funny. No, it's not. I once loved a woman who played the saxophone. This was back in high school. She was a white girl raised in a house surrounded by farmland, though her family did not farm. To get to her house, one had to drive almost a mile down a dirt road between fields of wheat. Therefore, wheat became and has remained for me the most erotic grain. So yes, this poem now contains a saxophone and some humor. Sexy wheat? Sexy wheat. And sexy wheat is now the official name of this poem. That white girl's father hated me because I was Indian. Well, yes, I was Indian. But I'm Indian now, too. I've always been Indian, even when I didn't want to be. While I was making love with that high school girl, don't worry, I was in high school too, I never once paused to think or say aloud, I am an Indian. I have an urge to call up that girl's father and tell him that I resented but understood his hatred of my Indianness, but that I never made love to his daughter as an Indian. Although this morning, as I brushed my teeth, I thought, I'm an Indian brushing his teeth. But strangely enough, as I flossed soon after brushing, I only thought I'm flossing my teeth. I have no explanation for this. But I'll make one up right now. It has something to do with wheat. That white girl whom I loved never once played the saxophone. The half-jokey, half-serious nature of this sonnet is quite characteristic of Sherman Alexie's work, as is the concern with what it means to be an Indian, as one can see from the title of his short story collection, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, or his young adult novel, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Now, does the number 14 suffice to make this a sonnet? And by the time we've reached this extreme, I'm not sure what I think myself. But like the Billy Collins poem with which I began this talk, it does deliberately call up our previous experience of traditional sonnets by its title, only to upset whatever expectations that we might have. Rather than end on that wishy-washy note, I'd like to conclude this talk with a sonnet I'm pretty sure is a sonnet, albeit irregular. It's by Adrienne Rich, who's one of the most important American poets since World War II. I also like this poem because it is about January weather, and as I speak, it is below zero here in Wisconsin. The line that the worst of winter can come in April also seems appropriate here. Look, this is January. The worst onslaught is ahead of us. Don't be lured by these soft gray afternoons, these sunsets cut from pink and violet tissue paper, and by the thought the days are lengthening. Don't let the solstice fool you. Our lives will always be a stew of contradictions. The worst moment of winter can come in April, when the peepers are stubbornly still, and our bodies plod on without conviction, and our thoughts cramp down before the sheer arsenal of everything that tries us, this battering, blunt-edged life. And Rich is talking about life as much as about the weather, of course. If you'd like to read more of her work, let me recommend the Norton Critical Editions, which include some helpful critical essays on her work, which can, I think, be difficult at times. And if you'd like to look for more sonnets, or almost sonnets, many of those I read today can be found in the Penguin Book of Sonnets. And, of course, you can find almost anything on the net. In the meantime, I'm Bob Canary. I'm a long-retired professor of English from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and my email is canary@uwp.edu. Thanks for listening.